Karen Barr and the Commissioner will take it from here with a fireside chat. Karen, I don't see the fire.
There's no fire, John, but I certainly feel the heat. There have been lots of developments over the last several weeks, if not several days. Commissioner, a lot has happened since our prep call, even just last week. But before we get started, let me say the code word for all of you with CE is chat, C-H-A-T. And we're going to continue our chat by talking about the issue of the last several days, really, ESG. The new administration has made very clear that it's going to focus a lot on ESG and climate change. There's already been a flurry of activity, including yesterday's announcement of an enforcement task force specifically focused on ESG and climate change. Acting Chair Lee has hired Satyam Khanna to a special position focused on climate. There's been an investor alert, an announcement from the Division of Corporate Finance, and the exam priorities announced Wednesday also stated an enhanced focus on climate. Commissioner, you and Commissioner Roisman issued a statement yesterday afternoon commenting on these developments and observing that they seem to be a continuation of the work the Commission has already been doing for decades. Could you expand on your views about whether these announcements represent new policy or just an emphasis on existing policy?
Well, I have to start out, Karen, by first thanking you for the chance to be with you all today, and second, giving my disclaimer, which may not be necessary in light of the conversation on ESG, but the views that I represent are my own views and not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners. There has been a number of announcements over the last couple weeks on climate specifically and ESG more broadly. And so I've been puzzling through reading them, I think maybe the way some of the rest of you have. And as far as I can tell, it's really just a continuation of the work that has been going on at the SEC for a long time. You know, obviously anything from the public company perspective, anything that's material needs to be disclosed already. From the investment advisor perspective, it's important for advisors and asset managers who are running funds to be telling folks what it is their objectives are, and then how they're achieving those objectives. And that should actually match reality. But I think that that's pretty well understood for fiduciaries, that they need to be upfront with their clients. And on the exam side, again, I think there's the exam division of exams will be out looking at what advisors are doing, but they're looking across a number of areas. We've got a lot of risk areas that exams is going to be looking at, and so sure, they'll look at whether people are being upfront with their objectives, but they'll be looking at other things as well. The concern on the enforcement side, and again, we can bring cases like the ones that seem to be envisioned with this announcement. But the concern there is that to the extent it's designed to be sort of a follow-on to what CorpFin is doing, or to, potentially, take on enforcement recommendations, I suppose, from exams, you would hope that some of this would allow, we'd provide the guidance before we start bringing the enforcement actions. And so I think part of the point of the statement that we put out was to say, hey, if there's really going to be a sea change, then the commission needs to be involved in whatever that sea change is.
Right. And I guess from my perspective on the enforcement task force, it could be, an allocation of resources signaling. We saw that with the asset management unit, certainly. Anytime you devote dedicated resources to an effort or a unit, there's going to be activity there, whether there's a change of regulation or not. It's, a matter of dedicated resources, perhaps.
Well, I think that that's a good point, Karen, because when you look at the breadth of what we could be bringing enforcement cases on, there's always more to be done than resources. So we're always making these kind of calls about what we can do. So that is potentially true. If you've got a set of people who are looking for issues in a particular area, then you're likely to see more cases in that area. But again, you better have the legal authority for those cases and also the facts to back them up. So that's something that, in my position as a commissioner, I'll be looking at each case on its merits.
Definitely appreciate that, and folks should obviously be matching up what they do and what they say, right? I mean, that has always been the case, and now there's going to be a unit looking at that area very specifically. In terms of also enforcement, they seem to indicate that right off the bat, the first thing they were going to look at was issuer disclosure. It sounds like you feel there's sufficient guidance in this area. Where do you see the commission going on issuer disclosure?
Well, it's hard to tell. And for one thing I should say is when we talk about a unit, this isn't the creation of a whole new unit. This is taking people who are doing lots of things, and one of the things they'll be doing, as far as I understand it, one of the things they'll be doing is these types of investigations. So there could be more that the Division of Enforcement has in mind, but as far as I understand, that's kind of how it will work. And in terms of guidance from Corp Fin, I think we've got guidance out there from 2010. And generally, I think that a lot of this stuff is picked up anyway by our principles-based regime. It takes a lot for me to think that we need to get to the point of having very specific disclosure mandates for anything. I'm open to those conversations. I'm certainly open to hearing why a particular metric might be appropriate to be considered by every company across every industry, but I think that's a pretty high bar to meet. Now, it's a little difficult for me to know where we're going to go because we are in a period of transition. Gary Gensler had his hearing earlier this week, and if he is confirmed, he could be here sometime I would assume he would be here sometime this spring. Not making any predictions on timing or confirmations, but and so he will come in and we'll be thinking about the agenda that he wants to set and where priorities fall. And so we'll see whether one of those things is to revisit this disclosure. But I think based on what the Corp Fin announcement said, there is certainly going to be consideration by the staff of whether the existing guidance is working, and perhaps they'll make a recommendation to the commission for changes.
One of the areas that is going ahead quite rapidly are European and global standards. Do you have a view on how the SEC should interact with the European regulators and how the standards should interplay with whatever the U.S. does?
Well, the Europeans certainly are moving quite fast, and they're moving, I think, quite aggressively in terms of setting a taxonomy and really being much more, I would describe it as more merit regulation than is really consistent with the approach that the U.S. takes. It's really trying to drive capital away from certain areas and toward other areas, and trying to co-opt, I would say, investment asset managers into that effort. And so I would hope that we don't follow that same route. I think our capital markets work really well in allocating capital where capital can do the best for society. So I would be very reluctant to try to centrally plan that through some kind of a centrally designed taxonomy. At the same time, I think there are real challenges for asset managers who are working both in Europe and in the United States, and they're feeling pressure from their European investors to do what those European investors need to do because of the regime that they operate in. And so I think there are going to be a lot of challenges. We're certainly having conversations at the international level, and I expect that that will continue. And there may be, look, I mean, as I said, I don't necessarily represent the views of the commission, and the views of my colleagues may be different, and so there may be more coordination on that front. I think one of the things, that I used to serve on one of the Financial Stability Board subcommittees, and I've since been moved off of that, and so I don't know as intimately what's happening there as I used to.
Understood. And from our perspective, Europe kind of put the cart before the horse in terms of requiring asset manager disclosure ahead of issuer disclosure. And we certainly would not want to see that sequencing be repeated here, and very much want to emphasize that regulators should not decide for investment managers how to do their jobs. So neither forbid or chill ESG investing, which I think we were concerned was happening with some of the rules at the DOL, nor mandate anything particularly specific in terms of how our managers invest. So that
I think the difficulty, though, comes. Oh, sorry for cutting you off, but I think the difficulty comes with asset managers have been really embracing this ESG label, right? And understandably so. It draws in a lot of dollars. And so I think that's why there's been a lot of focus here and abroad on what asset managers are saying versus what they're actually doing. And that's a complicated issue. I fully agree with you that it's really important for government not to step in and say, wait, we'll tell you what it means to be an ESG manager, or we'll tell you how you have to manage. But I also think it's important for asset managers, when they say we're managing according to some sort of ESG philosophy, explain what it is, and also be honest with your clients about whether sacrificing gains or not, economic gains, because it can be very tempting just to say, sort of adopt this Pollyannish view that ESG investing, no matter what it entails, and it can entail lots of different things to lots of different people, that no matter what approach you take, it's going to lead to higher returns than non-ESG investing. So if you're going to claim that, then bring along the empirical research to show, and it can't be just this generalized empirical research. It needs to be very specific to the path that you're taking to do your ESG investing.
Yeah, we certainly agree that there has to be clarity to investors about what your strategy is, and you have to follow what you say you're doing. I mean, that's, Fiduciary 101, right? Absolutely. Let me actually just take this chance to remind the audience that you can submit Q&A. We've already started to get a few. So Commissioner Peirce is willing to take questions, so feel free to enter them in the chat. Let's turn now to another topic that has a lot of Q&A around it as we have a new administration, and that's fiduciary duty, the standard of conduct package. There's been a lot of speculation in the press about whether the package will be reopened under the new administration. What do you see happening in this space?
I think the most likely thing that will happen is what makes the most sense, right? We should always be open to rethinking rules. That's never, never territory that we shouldn't be willing to enter. But at the same time, this rule set is a pretty new rule set. And I mean, it's very new. And there was a lot of work done during implementation. We pledged to work with firms as they tried to implement this and help them answer questions. We've put out lots of FAQs. Our examinations program, as I said, they're out working with firms. And so it makes sense to me to see how this all plays out. And then if we conclude there are things that need to be changed or clarified or eliminated, whatever it is, then we can come back and do that. And I suspect that any new chair looking at this would probably want to see how it plays out. I'm a believer that I think the new standard gives us new abilities to bring cases that would have been harder to bring in the past. So I'm optimistic, and I think we've seen really good efforts on the parts of firms to comply with the different aspects of this package. So I'm hopeful, and I think we ought to wait before we make major changes.
And in terms of your point on enforcement and examination, Pete Driscoll at our conference yesterday said that they were certainly going to be having an expanded focus on Reg BI and the fiduciary interpretation. And you certainly may learn a lot from the results of those examinations. One of the things that came up in the consideration phase, and I think is continuing to came up in our conversation yesterday, was whether Form CRS, there should be additional investor testing, how useful it is turning out to be now that the first round of forms have gone out. Will there be more data collection on or investor testing on the form?
That's an interesting question, and I'm certainly open to that. I think we should see how it's working. As I've been complaining about for many years now, is I feel like we just sometimes take a disclosure form, and we say, well, this is going to be the answer. And when I look at Form CRS, and this is not a criticism of any particular firm's Form CRS, but it is so dense. And it is not, some of the ones I've seen are they're not very inviting to read. And so I go back to saying, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could really push people? And again, I think it's up to each firm to figure out what the client base that you serve is and how that client base is best served. But I think often a non-paper-based digital format of some sort would be more effective at achieving what we're trying to achieve. And we did offer people the ability to experiment with that, but I think the message was still we expect you to have too much a default paper message. We expect you to have that paper ready to go. And there was so much that we wanted crammed in there that it really is difficult. And I think that's one of the pieces of feedback we've gotten was, wow, is it hard to get all this information in such a short form? And so I'm open to, investor testing. I'm open to reconsidering how we go about Form CRS. I don't know what a new chair will decide to do.
We are definitely hearing that it was difficult to include all of the information in the page limits, particularly with firms with multiple types of businesses and clients. It was challenging, and that made innovation with it challenging.
It becomes a compliance exercise in some ways. You've got to get the form. And look, I'm not trying to prejudge. I haven't done a comprehensive survey of Form CRS, but that was the initial feedback I heard, and that makes me worry that people are spending their innovative juices on trying to make sure they're complying with all of the requirements of it instead of actually thinking about what is the objective here, which is to get people in a place that they really understand what the firm is providing to them and they understand what their options are and if they need to go somewhere else or if, what they can get at this particular firm.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and that's the point of it, really. Turning now to what's happening in the markets, we've gotten some questions from the audience related to that. So why don't we head there next? There are any number of places we could go, but obviously a lot of activity with GameStop and Rocket and any other meme stocks. In terms of your preliminary views, what are you seeing out there that you think the commission should be really looking closely at?
Well, I appreciate you saying preliminary because we are doing an investigation of kind of the multi-layered events that occurred. We're looking at a lot of different things, both from a potential enforcement perspective and also from a potential do we need to change our rules perspective. from my perspective, having retail investors want to participate in the markets and do so through involvement with individual stocks, there's nothing wrong with that. I think it can be a way for people to get excited about investing. And we all know that while lots of Americans participate in our markets, a lot don't. And so we do want to draw in a new generation of investors. And so I think that's kind of the positive side. And of course, you have to be careful, and this is something that we tell investors all the time. You have to be careful when you get involved in something like this, and you have to realize that there's always risk associated with investing, particularly when it's investing in stocks that a lot of other people are interested in and that are moving rapidly up and down. So that's one piece of it. I think another piece of it that are the plumbing of the markets, the mechanical pieces of the markets actually worked quite well. But this has been a really fun time to see actual, mainstream newspapers and media talking about settlement times. So I think that yeah, I mean, it's fun. This is a topic that didn't get a lot of attention before, but it's one that we should think about. I think it's easy to say, okay, well, we can, use new technology to go to real-time settlement. And new technology can help us to get to faster settlement, but we also have to think about the structural changes that would imply, and it would really be quite a dramatic shift. And even if we go to T+1, the shift is actually a major shift. I'm not saying it's not the right thing to do, but I think we need to think about what the costs and benefits would be. And in the meantime, we can be working on trying to address some of the manual parts of the system that could be sped up and made less, we could take risk out of the system by adding better technology into pieces of that process. And I think that's something that we can be working on already. And then we can think about the bigger questions of moving to T+1. There are a lot of other issues that people have raised, payment for order flow on the broker-dealer side, something to think about. But again, we have to remember that having retail access to the markets at amazingly low prices I think, has been beneficial to investors. Of course, we have to think about best execution and all those other kinds of things, and I think we'll be able to have those conversations.
Right, and short selling's come up, obligations with respect to self-directed investors. One of the questions in the chat was, what about individual investors who choose to make decisions based on anonymous chat rooms? Should the SEC play any role in that?
Well, again, I think manipulation is something that we are familiar with dealing with, and this is maybe a new venue, but it's something that we can deal with. Now, it can get more complicated if you can't figure out who's doing the talking and whether they're institutional or retail and so forth. So I think those are all things that we'll be looking at. But in general, I think if investors want to spend their money based on what they hear in a chat room, that's kind of their decision. It's incumbent upon us to, again, provide people with warnings that, when you're getting anonymous advice from someone, there may well be an ulterior motive for that advice. And I think that's something people need to know and understand. I think a lot of people went into this eyes wide open, but I'm sure that there were some people who didn't, who just thought, wow, this is a great way to make a lot of money quickly, and may have found out that it's also a great way to lose a lot of money quickly. So, that's something that we have to think about. And I think another piece of this is, look, we care a lot about market integrity, and we care about companies wanting to be in our public markets. And so one concern that I have is if stock prices are extremely volatile, that can be a real disincentive for companies to take advantage and avail themselves of our public markets. And so how can we think about that? And is there anything that we need to do on that front?
Yeah, no, that is obviously very important. Another important topic that I want to make sure we get to is cybersecurity and privacy. There's been a lot of recent developments. There's the SolarWinds breach, obviously. Recently, there's been additional states getting in on the Privacy Act, if you will. Most recently, Virginia, we've been hearing about. Do you have a view on whether the SEC should be doing anything more to further its guidance and activities with respect to these areas?
Well, I think the flip side of my always trying to push people to use more technology is that with it comes new risks. And I mean, this is certainly the world we're in now. We've seen ransomware attacks, we've seen hacks, we've seen people SIM swapping and stealing people's phones so that compromises two-factor authentication. So there are all kinds of risks that arise in this area, and it's something that everybody needs to be vigilant about. A concern that I have is that, you know, bigger companies can pour a lot of money into defenses and identifying problems. It is much more difficult for the smaller firms, but the damage can be, you know, massive with small firms too. And so smaller firms need to figure out ways that they can rely on external parties to help them make sure they're up to snuff there. We at the SEC, I think, need to encourage firms to communicate with us. You know, that's something that there are already regulatory obligations along those lines, but it's first, I think our concern first and foremost should be to work together. And so if there is more help that we can provide, I think that's great. I don't want to get into a position where we're putting out super prescriptive guidance, because I think the technology that the bad actors are using is changing really fast, and their techniques are changing fast. And so if we put out guidance, it can become outdated quickly. So I'd like to view this more as, let's find ways that we can work together if we can be helpful. I mean, I've heard that when our examiners go in, they can actually be very helpful in kind of, you know, look, they're not going to tell people what to do, but the questions that they ask can actually be really helpful to firms in figuring out how to hold themselves to a higher standard. So I'd like to see more of that kind of work go on. And certainly I welcome any suggestions from people about what we can be doing to be helpful.
That's great. We appreciate it, and the risk alerts and the questions from from examiners, the putting out the books and records information that they're going to be asking. All of that transparency has been very helpful. We only have a minute or two. Sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
we're out of time. One other area is, you know, trying to figure out which third parties you can rely on can be difficult. And so again, I think if that's not something that we can do, but maybe that's something that advisors can work on together.
Very much appreciate that. In the interest of time, maybe just a quick lightning round. And before I do that, I'm told I should tell you that the second CE code word is chat2, the number 2. CHAT 2. So enforcement policy, this is going to be probably maybe too much for a lightning round, but a lot has happened with that: contingent settlements, whistleblower changes, who can issue subpoenas from inside the building. Quick thoughts on your enforcement policy and philosophy and views on what's going on?
Well, look, I think it's really important to keep the decision-making authority resting at the commission level. And I think that's one unfortunate thing that happened with respect to the settlements, for example, is that it's really important for people settling to know what the consequences of that settlement will be. This is not a guessing game. This is serious for them. And that's why I was sad to see that particular change. But again, we'll always, as a commissioner, I take the responsibility seriously of considering the facts and circumstances of each case.
And real quick, e-delivery, something near and dear to our heart. Your views?
Near and dear to mine too. No, I mean, I hope we can make progress on that. And I think the pandemic and everyone relying on digital for everything is going to help us in that regard.
Terrific. Well, unfortunately, we did run out of time, but we could talk a lot. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your perspectives and insights on a very busy week for all of you at the Commission.